Advanced Studio Classroom is on the air. Working in a garden may be just the therapy you need. Stay tuned to find out why. Welcome back to Advanced Studio Classroom. My name is Brandon. I'm your host for today. We continue our lifestyle article entitled Gardens for Cancer Patients. And we have our two panelists back in the studio. Welcome back, Pauline and Rebecca.
Thanks. I wouldn't miss it.
Happy to be back.
What exactly are we talking about with regards to gardens, Pauline?
Well, we have a very specific focus for this article. We're talking about different cancer patients who found comfort and joy in their gardens after having received a cancer diagnosis. In fact, I think in all of these, we're going to hear about victims of, well, not victims, the people who have gone through breast cancer diagnoses.
You know, when you hear that you have cancer, that's the scariest thing, really, because so many people suffer from that, and there are lots of diseases that would be scary, but I think that's the one that probably people fear the most, maybe.
Well, people fear cancer because they're not sure what will happen. It's not like the flu where you kind of know, like, if I take those drugs for a week or 10 days, I will get well. But with cancer, there's so many possibilities because the cancer cells, they can spread in different ways. Yeah. So for one person, you might get well, but for another person, it might be terminal.
Yeah. And, you know, science has come a long way. There are more people who are surviving cancer today than in the past, but there are also still a lot of people who don't survive. So it's really scary. And so we met a lady yesterday. Her name is Kelly White Rubin, and we learned about her gardens. We learned about the difficulties she went through with breast cancer. And we also met a lady named Karen Gleason, who deals with patients and health services, and she was talking about how gardening can really help people who are dealing and battling with this disease. So today we're going to learn about others who have fought this disease, and we're going to see how gardens have helped them. Yesterday, Pauline talked about how she's worked in gardens, and Rebecca shared some about gardening and so forth, and flowers, and how we enjoy just going out in nature, and how therapeutic that is. We keep talking about that word. So we're continuing that discussion today. If you have your magazine, please open it up to page 37. You can also follow along on your digital device as we have our first reading. We'll read there in the left-hand column down through line 23.
Pretty in Pink. Vera Caponia admires the walkway she calls her breast cancer garden. On the soil sits a pink ribbon mosaic stepping stone that Caponia crafted from pink tiles. When she planted the area, she was recovering from a stressful year, building up a new business, illustrating 4 books with crazy deadlines, raising 3 children, moving her family of 5 while their house underwent an extensive renovation, and receiving a breast cancer diagnosis. Many people gave me pink ribbon pins that year, and the summer I returned to the house, I just kept buying pink annuals and soon started buying pink perennials, said Caponia, 59. I always have in the back of my head what my surgeon said to me, that stress caused this. The only other risk factor I had for cancer was that I didn't exercise, so I started walking and running and continued vegetable gardening, she said.
Here we meet a lady named Vera Caponia, and she's admiring the walkway she calls her breast cancer garden.
That's right. And there's a couple reasons she calls it that. One is because we read a little further down in this section that most of the flowering plants that she's chosen to plant here are all pink. And pink is the color that is used to symbolize the fight against breast cancer. So sometimes you'll see a pink ribbon like the one that we see in our title. Here on page 36, there's a pink ribbon, and that's a sign of support for people who are fighting breast cancer. And so she's kind of taken that idea and turned a whole garden into her pink ribbon garden. And she also has made, you can see on the top of page 37, a really beautiful stepping stone that's a mosaic tile of a pink ribbon.
That's right. And mosaic is the idea you're bringing these different pieces together and you're creating a pattern or a picture. And oftentimes you're using glass or colored stone, or usually that's what you will see. And that is beautiful. She did an excellent job, creating that, and it's a part of her garden. And so that's something that she can be proud of. When she planted the area, she was recovering from a stressful year building up a new business. But she was doing more than that. What else was she doing, Rebecca?
Well, she was doing a lot. I actually feel stressed out just reading it. She was building a new business. She was illustrating 4 books at the same time. Illustrator is basically someone who draws the pictures, like in what we call illustrations, usually for children's books. Yeah. Like we have picture books, and the illustrations are very beautiful. So she was illustrating 4 books, and at the same time she was raising 3 children, and she was moving her family because her house was undergoing a big renovation. Or maybe people here in Asia don't do renovations as often as in North America, but a lot of North Americans love to renovate their house. Like my cousin, like he'll renovate his basement one year, and then another year he'll renovate the kitchen. And to renovate just means you make like major changes to that space.
Maybe you get new cabinets, a new sink or something for the kitchen, and you just make it look brand new.
Yeah, it's like a construction project, right? And in this case, apparently it was such a large renovation that it wasn't just one room, it was like the whole house. They had to move somewhere else while that was happening. So all of these things are happening. She has, she's working, she's illustrating books that have like really intense deadlines. She's just trying to be a mom and also move her family while all of this construction stuff is happening. And then on top of all of that, she receives a breast cancer diagnosis. This really heavy, scary thing all of a sudden happens in the midst of all that.
So she, needless to say, had a lot going on, a ton of things happening, and she has this cancer diagnosis on top of all the things she's doing. Well, she says, many people gave me pink ribbon pins that year. In the summer, I returned to the house. And so she just kept buying pink flowers as well. They're described as, the first one is annuals, Rebecca.
Yeah, annual is basically a plant that lives for just 1 year or maybe one season. So basically, if you buy an annual, you'll have to buy another one next year because it just flowers 1 year or one season. And that's in contrast to a perennial. I like perennials because it's a lot less work. Like you plant it once, and every year at a specific time, it will bloom. Or some flowers, they might bloom more than once a year.
All right.
Yeah, I always have this picture in my head of going to a greenhouse in the spring with my mom, and all of us kids would go, and she'd let us each pick out maybe 1 or 2 flowers that we were going to plant in the yard, and she'd kind of give us, okay, this is the area where they weren't too expensive, right? And then she'd say, okay, you can pick out 2, but make sure they're perennials because we want them to come up again next year. So then we learned that word, and she'd show us, and then we'd go pick out the perennials that we would plant in the garden for that year, and then the next year they'd come back.
You get more out of that, right? You can see them more often. Well, I always have in the back of my head, she said, this is Vera Caponia speaking, and she says what her surgeon had told her that stress caused this. Now, I want to talk about that phrase of having something in the back of your head. That sounds kind of funny, but we use that sometimes to mean what?
Yeah, it means that there's something that you're kind of thinking about a lot, but not that you just like sit down and think about it. Like, I'm going to think about this thing right now. It's just kind of running in the background. Like every once in a while when you have a spare minute, you just realize that you're continuing to think about. That it's that idea is kind of subconscious, kind of conscious. It's just something that you kind of can't stop thinking about.
All right. And so she was thinking about what her surgeon said to her, that stress caused all of this. And that's a word that gets our attention. We can all relate to stress. And so we need to be careful because that can cause health problems. And she's saying that her surgeon told her that. And what about the risk factor? She talks about that as well, Rebecca.
Well, a risk factor is something that might cause a illness. Risk factors for cancer, one of the ones here is stress. The other risk factor that they mentioned is she didn't exercise. So she didn't exercise, and if you don't exercise, that usually raises your risk for multiple kinds of illnesses, like whether it's cancer or heart disease, high blood pressure. Just so many kinds of symptoms and illnesses can happen if you don't exercise. And this is something I think we all know, but in our busy lives, often we just don't put in the time or effort to exercise. So I think this is a good reminder for all of us.
Yeah, so what did she do? She started walking and running, but she also continued the vegetable gardening. I always think you need to choose something that you kind of like for a type of exercise. Don't choose something you hate. That's kind of not the best route to go, is it, Pauline?
Absolutely. I know we talked yesterday about things that are good for our spirits, that is like a physical exertion, but it's also good for our spirits. And you said running, and I thought, oh my gosh, that would not be the one for me. You know, it would still be good for my body. I get it, right? But it would not. I don't think it would take a lot of time of me doing that before my spirit really could find enjoyment in it, right? So there are other physical activities I think I could more quickly find enjoyment in while also giving my body some, exercise and getting the benefits of that.
But do something, right? Yes. And that's important. And we need to deal with stress. And sometimes we need to look at the big picture, right? And realize what's really important. Sometimes we stress out over small things and then it's not really that important. And sometimes we are stressed out over things that are important, but I think we can cut some of it out if we change our perspective. Well, next, we're going to learn more about garden therapy as we meet another lady who has gone through, has suffered from cancer and has conquered that. But we're also going to see how gardening helped her. We're going to have our second reading starting there in line 24, the left-hand column, and we're just going to read down through the rest of that column.
Garden therapy. When Abby Lovitz Melendez got a diagnosis of cancer, it was a shock, she recalled. Cancer doesn't happen to you, it happens to everyone else, she said, explaining how incredulous she was at the time. I was working full-time and had 3 young children, and I was worried about my life and that I wouldn't be there for my kids and my husband. It was difficult to keep her spirits up. It was very easy to stay in the house and be depressed at that time, she said.
Next, we meet a lady. Her name is Abby Melendez, and she got a diagnosis of cancer. And of course, this was a shock. I like what she says here next because a lot of us can relate to this, Pauline. She's saying that, cancer, that's what happens to everybody else, but not to me, right?
Oh, that's really interesting. Yeah, you read it a different way than I did. And I think that might be what she's saying. I was thinking about it in terms of like, that when cancer does happen to you, it happens to everybody else around you as well. That when I was thinking, you could be right too. This is a great example of where one sentence could be taken a couple different ways.
And we don't have the full
unfortunately,
context.
we don't have, or we just don't have Abby here to ask her which side she was thinking of. And she might have been thinking about both. I was thinking that, especially if we're talking about a mother, when a cancer diagnosis happens to her, it's not just really her, then all of a sudden you're thinking about my kids and my husband, and if you have a job, it's happening to all. There's this huge ripple effect of all the people that cancer happens to at the same moment. And I think especially if you're like the parent of small children, it feels like this is happening. You're almost more concerned about how it's happening to your family than it
Yeah.
is how it's happening to you.
Right. They are having to suffer from that as well.
But you also have a good point. It could also be just a side of like you always think like cancer happens to other people. It's not
Right.
going to happen to me.
Right. Yes, you don't think about it till it happens to you, right? And she was really incredulous, right? She talks about how incredulous she was at the time. If you're incredulous, you're kind of doubting something. You're not able to believe it, right? And sometimes we can be in denial, right? We can think, oh, this is not happening, right? We can be in such shock that we don't want to believe it. So what was she doing at the time, Rebecca?
Well, like the Vera lady that we had read
Yeah.
about a little bit earlier, she was very, very busy. She was working full time. She had 3 young children she was raising, and she was doing that at the same time. She was very, very busy. So she was worried that how can I get cancer, and then how can I take care of my family? What about my job? I think these are all questions that she must have been thinking at the time.
Yeah, how can she take care of her kids and her husband and so forth? And so, she already has to deal with this terrible disease, and then she's worrying about that as well, and that's not helpful.
Right, there's a lot of fear, right?
Yeah.
The fear, the worry that she wouldn't be there for her kids and her husband. And again, there's a couple possibilities for what she means. One, just that like physically being so, racked by disease that she wouldn't get to be like emotionally there for them, that she wouldn't be as present as a mom
Right.
and as a wife and as an employee maybe too as she'd want to be. But there's also kind of this other very dark side of like just literally
Physically,
this
yeah.
question of like, will she live? Will
Right.
she be able to physically be in their lives?
Right.
What does this mean for the future? And then that's scary stuff. And that is the reality of a diagnosis all of a sudden puts these heavy questions and fear in people's lives.
Or even if she's alive, but she's fighting this disease, so that takes a lot out of her, so she can't do as much as she once did. And so in a sense, she feels like, oh, maybe I can't be there for my kids in the way that I would like to, or for her husband. So it was difficult for her to keep her spirits up. That's a good phrase to highlight. What do we mean, Rebecca, if we say we're keeping our spirits up?
To keep your spirit up just means you continue to stay positive. Like, it's very easy to become depressed or negative, but if you keep your spirits up, you continue to believe that better things will come, and you're very positive.
All right.
But she's being honest and saying she was not doing that well, at least not all the time. And I think it's important to hear that. We often hear really like great self-help articles that are lauding the importance of keeping our spirits up and being positive. But I think it's also important to be honest that it's not easy. And there are times when you will not succeed at that. And you have to be honest and say, like, this is difficult. I am finding it way too easy to stay in the house and be depressed and struggling through that, but not giving up, right? Like finding, and I think that's the story of Melinda saying, like, she's being really honest about how dark that period was, but seems to have a really beautiful story of finding a way through that. And part of it is through gardening, right?
That's an excellent point. She was honest about this. Sometimes we don't want to be honest. We're kind of prideful, honestly. We need to be humble and say, I do need help. And it doesn't mean you complain all the time. I'm not talking about that. But like when you legitimately need help, you need to tell someone, tell your friends, and have those kinds of relationships where you can be authentic with people and say, hey, I'm going through a rough time. I could really use some help. And so that's where she was at. And it was very easy just to stay in the house and to be depressed. And we can all relate to that in different ways. Sometimes we just feel, we're depressed, and so we stay in. And what we actually need to do is get out, right? And I think that will automatically help us to some degree, is just to get out of the house. That's the first step. Well, next we're going to learn more about Melendez and her story. So stay tuned as we have our third and final reading. We're just going to read that right-hand column on page 37.
However, Melendez had marigolds, black-eyed Susans, lilacs, and crepe myrtles. Gardening got me outside, she said. Just being in the fresh air sort of healed me and made me thankful. There's something healing about watching something come to life, because it reminds you that life goes on, she said. I even like weeding. I hear the birds, see the squirrels, catch the slugs, and see the neighborhood dogs put their snouts under the fence, Melendez said. It's very calming to me. It brings me peace and takes my mind off things.
All right, well, Melendez, we learned that she was depressed, but she had some flowers and gardening kind of helped her to get out of the house.
Right. I like, again, this contrast. She's saying it was easy just to stay in and be in this really dark place, but she had something that did pull on her to get her to move outside and really brought her life. And hopefully we can all find things that will still pull us out when we're in dark spaces, that'll get us, outside in nature or with people. For her, it was her garden.
What is something for you two that you're kind of depressed or down? What do you like to do to kind of get yourself out of that?
I think you need to do happy things. Like we mentioned earlier, the things that make us happy. And you just have to do happy things. So one thing I like to do is go swimming.
Yeah.
And then I like to go have afternoon tea with my friends because I love to eat dessert. And that makes me happy, but you can't eat too much of that either.
Right.
Yeah, so you have to do things that make you happy.
Yeah,
and
being with people.
Being with people might help. And I find that getting out of the house also helps. Because when you're at home, you're not doing anything, your mind just keeps thinking about a problem over and over and over. So usually you get even more depressed. Yeah. So I think one of the keys to getting out of depression is you just need to get out.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
A few things for me. One, of course, is just calling my family, having people in my life that are supports that sometimes that means just sharing with them where I'm at, asking for prayer, being supported in my moments of just really struggling. Other times it's still calling, but listening to what's going on in their life and caring about them and kind of pulling myself out by being present to them. Also, I'm really grateful for being able to have a job. And I think, obviously, for somebody who's going through a serious illness, sometimes they also lose their ability to work, and then that's a different kind of struggle. But if you have the ability to work, man, I will say that I think being forced to get out of my house and just go to work will so often be the thing that keeps me centered and keeps me healthy when I'm having bad moments, because I kind of have to push that all aside and just do work. And by the time work's over, I've given myself enough space that I can come back to maybe those things that were feeling heavy before, and it just gives me a new perspective or some space between it.
Yeah, and we can take that for granted, too. We take our jobs for granted, and we can complain about different things, of course. But here are some people who they don't have the ability to work. And so then we realize, oh, okay, I should be thankful, right? And so when we read stories like this, it reminds us of how good we have it and how thankful we should be. And so I like what both of you said, being with people. I think for me, I'm an introvert, which means I kind of draw energy from like being by myself. But I don't like being by myself like all the time or anything like that. But I think when you're depressed, being around people, the right kind of people who are adding life into you can hugely benefit you.
But I also know I have friends who would say like starting to get really into running I have a friend who would say that was a major factor in turning his depression around. So I think everybody is different. Sometimes it's going to the gym, going to running. Other people it's going hiking, it's getting out into nature. Other people it's the social aspect or finding, I think at some point, if you are deep into a place of depression, you absolutely have to reach out to people for help. Like, I don't think you can just constantly say, well, I'm an introvert, I'm going to do this all on my own. At some point, you need help. But we all are going to have different tools that work more frequently for us, and it's good to know ourselves.
Getting outside of your own mind, that's why it's important to talk to people. But even like reading a book, you can get some like fresh ideas that add life into you and takes your mind off of the negative things. Well, here we see that Melendez, she says, gardening got me outside. She says, just being in the fresh air sort of healed me and made me thankful. There's something healing about watching something come to life because it reminds you that life goes on. And I think this is a great way, as we are nearing the end of our program, it's a great way to kind of end, talking about reminding you that life goes on. So she was seeing the flowers and all of that outside and the birds, and she was reminded of the beauty of life, Rebecca.
Yeah, I actually think in this aspect, gardening is very, very good because flowers don't stay the same forever. Like, you might wait for the flower to bloom, but the flower will eventually grow and the flower will open, the flower will bloom for a period of time, the flower then dies. But this cycle will happen over and over. So there is a lot of, it's refreshing to watch because things are not static. They're not staying the same. Like the flowers, the plants, they grow and then the cycle goes on. So when you see that, it reminds you that life is very precious and to live in the moment.
All right.
Not to worry so much about tomorrow because tomorrow, just like the garden, tomorrow will come, but your life will still go on.
Well, she enjoyed watching these flowers grow and so forth, but she even says she liked weeding. And I thought, well, that's a bit much for me, but hey.
Well, it made me think back to the first day we talked about the woman who says, like, yeah, it requires physical exertion and stamina to work in a garden. Definitely weeding can really be very physically exerting. But if you've gone through an illness and you didn't have physical strength, you didn't have stamina, and now you're able to, and you're able to like have the satisfaction of doing a hard work and watching your garden go from like full of weeds to now like all cleaned up and really looking nice. Like I can see where that's rewarding, and it's also a joy to feel your body working for you.
That's right. And you feel productive, right? You're doing something. You're helping this garden to kind of succeed because you're taking the weeds out and so forth. And so that's beneficial as well. Well, she says that she heard the birds and she was able to see the squirrels, and she was even able to catch some slugs. What is a slug, Rebecca? I haven't seen that. That word doesn't pop up very often. What is that?
Yeah, a slug is basically an animal that kind of looks like a snail, but it doesn't have its shell. So it's like, especially after it rains, like here in Asia, after it rains, often when you're on a path, maybe in the suburbs or maybe near a park, you'll see slugs on the ground.
Now, she said that she caught them. That makes me think of a kid would do that, but I guess she was into that too. Maybe that's like her childlikeness coming out.
Well, they also might be harmful for the garden, so she's probably getting rid of the pests.
There we go. There's a reason behind that. Okay, and then she would see the neighborhood dogs and put their snouts under the fence, just talking about their noses. And it's very calming to me. It brings me peace and takes my mind off things.
Yeah, to me, when she's describing all these things, it's just that reminder of when you're in the garden or in nature, depending on your personality type. It sounds like she's the kind of person who, again, you're not thinking about all these other things that are happening in your life. You're just focused on all of this life that's around you. So you're seeing all these little insects and the plants that are coming up, and I can't, that weed, I got to pull that out. And look at the neighborhood dog, and there's some squirrels, and you're just surrounded by all this vibrant life, and it can really make you present to that moment instead of having your mind be off thinking about all the what ifs and what's going to happen and worries that could be on your mind.
All right. Well, we are all out of time for this month's lifestyle article. We hope that you enjoy some peace and quiet today. Just take some time to enjoy life with family and friends. Until next time, this is Brandon.
I'm Pauline.
I'm Rebecca.
Saying goodbye.
Goodbye.
Bye.